At this very moment, you are cradled in a gentle, effortless warmth. You did not have to struggle or strive for it. The invisible heat simply flows through your home, quiet and constant. Near your doorway hangs a soft, heavy coat, crafted beautifully without you ever having to take a life to make it. In your quiet kitchen, nourishment sits safely on the shelves, destined to remain perfectly preserved for next week, completely untouched by whatever bitter cold might be howling outside your window. Now, imagine all of those modern comforts suddenly stripped away. Picture only your fragile, bare skin exposed to a winter so incredibly fierce and merciless that it could steal your life in your sleep, long before you ever had the chance to wake up. For the vast majority of human history, this terrifying vulnerability was simply normal. This was not merely a single harsh season. For hundreds of thousands of agonizing years, your distant ancestors endured genuine, brutal ice ages. During these times, colossal, towering sheets of ice smothered entire continents, and the biting cold could freeze a human body to death in a matter of mere hours. Yet, against all unimaginable odds, they somehow survived. You yourself are the living, breathing proof of their triumph. Every single ancestor in your long lineage lived long enough to pass the precious flame of life down to you, meaning that every last one of them fought and won a desperate battle against winter. A battle where defeat meant absolute extinction. So, how did they achieve this miracle? How did a soft, hairless animal, whose body evolved to thrive in the baking heat of the African savanna, survive the most hostile, freezing weather this planet has ever unleashed? That is the incredible tale I want to unfold for you. It is, without a doubt, one of the greatest survival stories ever told, and yet almost no one realizes just how perilously close we came to vanishing forever. To truly understand, we must be brutally honest about the horrors they faced. The word winter today conjures peaceful images of a chilly afternoon and a cozy campfire, but their reality was nothing like that. The last glacial maximum reached its grim, agonizing peak roughly 26,000 to 19,000 years ago. Massive, unrelenting ice sheets crushed Europe, Asia, and North America. The vast landscape was flat, desolate, and utterly open, offering absolutely nothing to obstruct the howling, razor-sharp winds. Trees were scarce, almost impossible to find, and food vanished entirely for grueling months at a time. Humans, quite simply, are not biologically designed to endure such starvation and cold. We are the children of warm climates, and our fragile bodies still behave as such. We possess no thick, protective fur. We lack the insulating blubber of a seal. We cannot miraculously slow our heartbeats to hibernate through the deadly winter like a cave bear. If you strip a modern human naked in the true, biting cold, they have only a few fleeting hours, not days, before their core temperature plummets, their organs shut down, and the quiet end arrives. Meanwhile, the magnificent beasts surrounding our ancestors were beautifully engineered for this frozen world. Great mammoths were protected by dense fur and thick layers of fat. Cave bears could sleep away the worst months, and herds of reindeer could easily migrate thousands of miles to warmer lands. Humans possessed none of these natural advantages. On paper, we should have been among the very first species to perish when the Great Freeze arrived. We possessed the wrong bodies, trapped in the wrong place, at the worst possible moment in Earth's history. Yet, we possessed two saving graces: a brilliant, forward-thinking brain that could plan, and incredibly nimble hands that could craft the very things our vulnerable bodies lacked. Ultimately, that proved to be enough, though only by the narrowest of margins. There was no single, miraculous trick that saved humanity. Instead, it was a brilliant tapestry of small innovations, where each clever solution resolved a lethal problem that otherwise would have wiped us out. This is the story of how they actually pulled off the impossible. It began, as all great human endeavors do, with the sacred spark of fire. Absolutely nothing could function without it, so that is where our survival truly started. Humans had already been coaxing fire from the earth for an incredibly long time, at least 300,000 to 400,000 years. By the time the deepest ice age descended, fire was no longer a mere comfort or a pleasant luxury. It was the very essence of life itself, and our ancestors had become masters of its flame. Modern archaeologists excavating ancient Ice Age hearths in the windswept plains of Ukraine fully expected to find crude, simple fire pits. Instead, they uncovered beautifully, meticulously designed fireplaces, one of which had blazed at an astonishing temperature of over 600 degrees Celsius, well over 1,100 degrees Fahrenheit. When precious wood grew desperately scarce across the barren, frozen steppes, these resilient people adapted, burning animal fat and dense bones to keep the flames alive. Fire provided them with vital warmth, cooked their scarce food, hardened their wooden tools, and gifted them precious hours of golden light during the dark seasons when the sun barely crept above the horizon. Soon, they learned a vital new secret: how to carry that precious warmth with them wherever they wandered. The fundamental problem with a campfire is its stubborn stillness. You cannot carry a roaring hearth on your back, and the moment you step away, the merciless cold is waiting to reclaim you. Thus, humans did something utterly unprecedented, something no other creature on Earth could conceive. They literally stole the warmth of wild beasts and draped it over their own fragile bodies. In the beginning, this adaptation was simple: rough skins draped loosely over shivering shoulders. Remarkably, ancient records show that early humans were already skinning formidable bears for their thick fur in northern Europe at least 300,000 years ago. We know this with absolute certainty because of the delicate, precise cut marks left forever on fossilized bear paw bones, located exactly where a hunter would slice to peel a heavy hide away cleanly. These robust bear pelts provided windproof, highly water-resistant winter cloaks. Yet, a loosely draped animal skin inevitably leaks precious body heat through every open gap, and such basic protection was far from enough to survive the brutal onslaught of a true ice age. The fix showed up around 30,000 years ago, and it was something so incredibly small that it almost sounds silly. It was the humble sewing needle, a slender, delicate piece of animal bone or mammoth ivory with a minuscule hole painstakingly drilled through its end. One eminent scientist even ventured to call it perhaps the most momentous invention in all of human history, and he truly has a profound point. The introduction of the needle meant, quite simply, that you could finally sew. It brought about closely fitted clothes, meticulously sealed seams, insulating layers, and protective sleeves that closed snugly at the wrist. A loose blanket casually thrown over your shivering shoulders and a tailored coat that fits your body perfectly are two vastly different things. And the tiny needle is precisely what transformed the former into the latter. Early modern humans may well have possessed significantly better-fitting garments than the Neanderthals did, a subtle advantage that might have crucially helped our kind survive through the absolute worst of the freezing epochs. Nor did they stop at fur alone. Pliant deer hide effectively cut through the biting wind, while remaining remarkably soft enough to be fashioned into cozy mittens and durable, waterproof boots. Moreover, before venturing out into the merciless cold, hardy hunters would generously rub a layer of animal fat, known as tallow, over their exposed faces and necks. This thick grease effectively sealed the skin, held precious body heat in, and stopped the howling wind from ruthlessly pulling their warmth away. It was simple, admittedly a little gross, but it worked wonderfully well. Out on the blindingly bright, sunlit snow, there lurked another silent danger that most modern people easily forget about: snow blindness. The intense, searing glare reflecting off the endless snow can easily blind a person. To combat this, resourceful northern hunters carefully carved incredibly thin slits into pieces of salvaged bone or wood and securely tied them over their eyes. These narrow slits cut way down on the agonizing glare, essentially creating the world's very first sunglasses, crafted entirely of bone. Popular imagination always pictures prehistoric cavemen hiding deep inside dark, sheltering caves. Yet, the historical truth is far more inspiring than that. A great many of these resilient people built their own sturdy shelters out on the wide, freezing plains. In what is now modern-day Ukraine and Russia, there were absolutely no natural caves and barely any forests to provide wood. Thus, they turned to the one monumental resource lying scattered around everywhere: the massive bones of woolly mammoths. At an archaeological site called Mezhirik, researchers discovered remarkable round houses constructed almost entirely from mammoth bones and curved tusks. Giant skulls and heavy leg bones were sunk deep into the frozen ground to serve as a solid base. Graceful ribs and sweeping tusks then curved upward to form the structural frame. There were literally hundreds of these heavy bones incorporated into just a single house. These dwellings were sunk partway into the earth and densely packed with insulating hides, soft moss, and rich soil, which held the internal heat remarkably well, enough to keep an entire family cozy and comfortable. The largest of these structures is about 18,000 years old, dating back to the very coldest depths of the Ice Age, and the site itself looks as though it was used repeatedly over hundreds of years. This stands as some of the oldest architecture we have ever discovered. These ancient people literally fashioned homes out of the remains of giants, and their architectural design was clever in ways one might never guess. Many of these winter homes featured a brilliant cold trap doorway, where the entrance was deliberately dug much lower than the elevated sleeping area. Since cold air is naturally heavy, it sank down into the lower entranceway and remained trapped there, while the lighter, warm air rose upward to where the family slept. They intuitively figured out this thermodynamic principle tens of thousands of years before anyone ever bothered to write down how it works. They also cleverly utilized snow, which sounds entirely backwards until you have actually felt its properties. Snow is, in fact, an outstanding natural insulator. If you pile thick, heavy walls of it around a shelter, the interior remains remarkably close to freezing, even when the biting air outside plummets to 30 degrees below zero. Long before anyone ever perfected the iconic igloo, these early humans already knew that seeking shelter under a deep snowbank was infinitely warmer than standing exposed in the open air above it. Exactly where you chose to build mattered immensely, too. People seeking refuge in dense forests had a much easier time than those living out on the wide-open plains, because a thick stand of trees naturally blocks a massive amount of the biting wind. A quiet walk through the woods on a truly brutal winter day is surprisingly calm and still compared to standing exposed in an open, windswept field. And for the small, annoying gaps and drafts where we would modernly use expanding foam or caulk, they tightly packed in damp moss, thick mud, and aromatic pine pitch, the sticky, resinous sap harvested from pine trees, to seal everything up perfectly tight. Staying warm keeps you alive for the night, but winter's far slower, more insidious killer is hunger. For agonizing months on end, there was almost nothing of substance to gather from the frozen ground and very little game to hunt. Consequently, they became extraordinarily skilled at preserving food far ahead of time. Whenever they succeeded in making a big kill, they did not simply feast on it all at once. They carefully saved it. The freezing winter cold did half of the strenuous work, naturally freezing the fresh meat immediately after a successful hunt so that it was safely preserved for later days. They also skillfully smoked meat, dried it into tough jerky, and kept precious stores of dried wild fruit. They carefully stored these vital provisions in deep pits dug directly into the frozen ground and in cool, dark underground cellars where the earth kept it remarkably cold and safe through the long winter months. There is even fascinating archaeological evidence suggesting they weighed mammoth meat down with heavy stones and sank it deep into icy ponds to preserve it longer, functioning as a primitive natural refrigerator. None of this ingenious preservation required electrical power or complex mechanisms that could break down, could never suddenly fail like a modern freezer during a violent winter storm, and absolutely nothing was wasted. Every precious part of an animal was meticulously utilized. They became incredibly adept at extracting every single life-saving calorie from a carcass, a level of efficiency that is difficult for us to envision in a modern world where we routinely discard half of what we purchase. Their seasonal hunting was also highly organized and strategic. At a renowned archaeological site in eastern France, near a towering limestone rock, these resilient Ice Age hunters utilized crackling fire and seamless teamwork to drive entire herds of wild horses and majestic reindeer directly into a steep, natural trap. This was not a one-time event. For tens of thousands of years, they returned to this very same location over and over again. Secure a major kill, carefully dry the meat, and hoard it diligently for the bitter cold. This simple, relentless plan was the primary reason they survived. Yet, here is a subtle truth that is easy to overlook. These ancient people fully expected the winter. Their entire year was meticulously structured around preparing for its inevitable arrival. We, in our modern comfort, are the ones who are easily caught off guard. We blindly assume the power grid will always turn back on. And when a devastating storm strikes, we are left utterly shocked. They, however, were never caught by surprise. A vast portion of their year was dedicated to active preparation, and they relied deeply on one another. Far more people huddled together under a single, cramped roof than we could ever tolerate today, and this was entirely intentional. Human body heat becomes a remarkably powerful source of warmth when enough people are packed closely together. The person who had a spacious room all to themselves was not considered fortunate. They were merely cold and dangerously exposed. It was usually those living in isolation, particularly the fragile elderly, who perished first during a sudden, severe cold snap because there was no warm body beside them to share vital warmth. But this communal warmth does not mean Ice Age people lived in perpetual peace. Life remained brutally, unforgivingly hard. Crucial resources were desperately scarce, and occasionally humans themselves became a deadly threat to other humans. We know this for an undeniable fact that some of these ancient humans resorted to cannibalism simply to survive. When food became scarcer than an honest politician, these desperate Ice Age souls sometimes had absolutely no choice but to turn to the most extreme, horrifying measures for sheer survival. They also ingeniously utilized animals for essential warmth. Centuries later, during the harshest winters in medieval Europe and Russia, impoverished peasants would bring their precious livestock, including cows and sheep, directly into the bottom floor of their modest homes. These huddled animals radiated a massive amount of body heat, which naturally rose upward to gently warm the family living in the quarters above them. You essentially lived directly on top of your own furnace, and that living furnace was a cow. Sometimes, the penetrating cold went so incredibly deep that human bodies actually adapted biologically. The remarkable Yagan people, residing at the southernmost tip of South America, survived in a freezing, windswept environment while wearing virtually no clothing at all. To endure such harsh conditions, their metabolic systems ran significantly hotter than ours, generating substantially more heat from the inside out. They also adopted a deep, compact squatting position when resting, which tightly tucked in their limbs and dramatically reduced the amount of precious warmth they lost to the freezing air. Their ultimate defense against the biting cold was not a heavy coat, but rather their own physiological furnace turned up high. And then we encounter the absolute strangest theory of all. There exists a fascinating possibility that some early humans survived the brutal winter in a way that sounds entirely fabricated, by hibernating. At an archaeological site in Spain poetically named the Pit of Bones, dedicated scientists closely studied the remains of early human ancestors from roughly 430,000 years ago, who endured an incredibly harsh, glacial epoch. And these fossilized bones reveal something truly bizarre. The physical damage within them appears in predictable cycles, almost like clockwork. There are distinct seasonal markings, bone growth that abruptly stops and starts, and clear signs of severe vitamin D deficiency from lack of sunlight. Even teenagers exhibited a strange, repeatedly interrupted growth pattern. This is precisely the same telltale pattern observed in modern animals that undergo hibernation, a state where the metabolism slows down dramatically, normal feeding ceases, and the body begins to consume its own reserves. The researchers tentatively suggested that these ancient people, lacking the necessary fatty foods to survive a brutal winter, might have gone into dark caves and slowed their bodies down into a deep, prolonged sleep to patiently wait out the worst of the cold. The matter is far from settled. Many skeptical scientists vigorously argue against this hypothesis, suggesting various alternative explanations for that peculiar bone damage. We certainly cannot truly hibernate in our modern state, but the provocative idea is compellingly strange enough that serious scholars are still actively debating it. So, the idea of your ancient ancestors sleeping through winter like weary bears isn't something we can simply wave away. For hundreds of thousands of years, making it to spring was never a guaranteed certainty. Every single winter was a ruthless test you could easily fail, and failing meant a cold, silent death. Here is the remarkable part that truly captivates me. In a mere couple of thousand years, which is absolutely nothing on this vast timeline, We went from painstakingly stacking heavy mammoth bones to build a shelter, to effortlessly tapping a button for instant warmth. The deadliest force our ancestors ever confronted is now just a minor nuisance we complain about on the brief walk to a warm car. We conquered winter so completely that most people forgot it was ever a desperate war we were actively losing.